for Center for Ethics at Harvard University and from the University of Colorado in Boulder.
Oh, I see. Great, thanks. Righty. Thanks, David. So I'll just start with a health warning. This paper is going to be a little bit of an outlier relative to the other papers you're going to see in the conference and the panel. So you're going to see a lot of thoughtful legal analyses. There won't be any of that here, but there will be a lot of numbers. So just as a health warning, some people find that obscuring. I hope in this case it's going to be more clarifying, but I just wanted to let you know. So I guess we can start. So as almost all of you know, the FDA in its deliberations a lot of times seeks external advice, and this comes in the form of convening FDA advisory committees. And what are these committees? They are comprised of external experts, medical researchers, clinicians, biostatisticians, and there's always some patient or consumer representative at least. And so what do? They get together in meetings and they review the evidence related to safety and efficacy. And then there's some discussion, and then there's voting. So a lot of you know there's voting on whether to approve the drug, but there's also voting on scientific issues related to how people are interpreting the safety and efficacy data. So a problem comes in when there's some experts who have financial relationships that people think may affect the impartiality of decision making. So an example might be someone's a consultant for the sponsor of a drug, or they're a paid speaker for the manufacturer of a competing drug. And so a fair question might be, well, how do the financial interests of these members align with their voting behavior? And so you might think, well, if you have a relationship to a sponsor, well, you're interested in the sponsor doing well, so you may be more likely to favor the sponsor. Or symmetrically, if you have a tie to a competitor, maybe you're not so keen on having another product in the market. And so you may be less likely to favor the sponsor. So there have been some papers that have tried to get a handle on this. By far the most important one is the one that's been done by Peter Lurie and Sid Wolf and some others. And they basically find no relationship between having a tie to a sponsor and favoring the sponsor. And they look at meetings that took place between 2001 and 2004. And there are similar findings from a consultant report that expanded the number of years of analysis. And these are very important papers, but I think we may be at the point now where we may be able to improve a little bit on them. And sort of the main issue with the literature is that we're basically constrained by small sample sizes. So although it starts off, a lot of meetings happened between 2001 and 2004, but it turns out when we do the individual analysis and look at how people voted, it turns out the sample was only 11 meetings that had some kind of sponsor conflict in the analysis. And this is, so a lot of meetings were excluded for good reason. And similarly with the consulting report. And the main problem with this is, it's just really difficult to detect a relationship if you have a really small sample. And so if you have a small sample, you're almost always going to find zero, and that's not because there's no effect, it's because your sample was too small to pick up the effect. So that's one issue. And a second issue is, well, we might want to think about, well, what if somebody has multiple ties? What if they have a relationship to both the sponsor and a competitor? And so you might think, well, maybe there's some canceling out of interests. So there's some arms race going on. Maybe if a firm has a relationship to an individual, they may have a preferential advantage in terms of voting, but if all firms are doing the same thing, it's not really obvious how that's really going to work out or net out. So it seems important to be able to distinguish between someone having an exclusive tie to a sponsor and someone having ties to both the sponsor and its competitors. So what we're able to do is we're able to just vastly expand the sample and refine the models to get a better sense of what's going on. And so we were able to collect data on about 400 voting meetings at CDR that happened over 15 years. And this involved 1,200 questions. So as I mentioned, they're drug approval questions. People vote up and down on those. But they're also scientific questions. So an example of that might be, well, does drug X, increase the probability of stroke among people between age 57 and 85? So there's up and down voting on those issues as well that may affect the firm. And overall, we have 1,400 unique people who showed up at least once who voted during this 15-year period. And basically, we're just going to estimate the association between people's financial interests and their voting. Okay. So just to give you a sense of the kinds of financial relationships, by far the most prevalent one is consulting, which accounts for about a third of relationships.
And I'm going to have Mark just move over to the other chair so we can actually see the slide clearly. Sorry, Mark.
Sure.
Nope. Go ahead.
And the second most frequent financial interest is having some kind of ownership or income from royalties or licenses. And then 20% of conflicts relate to being a paid speaker. You can be a member of an advisory board. And finally, further down, you might have gotten a research grant from the sponsor or competitor. Okay. So the first thing that we do is, well, we have all this data. A reasonable thing to do would be, well, let's take a look at all the people with financial ties, compare them to the people who don't have financial ties, and look to see whether there's a difference in whether someone votes in favor of the sponsor. And when we do this, we find that if you have a conflict involving only the sponsor, you are about, as a first approximation, 1.5 times more likely to vote in favor of the sponsor than if you had no ties. So, and this is statistically significant. If you have a tie only to a competitor, and by the way, the benchmark is 1 here, so if you have a tie only to a competitor, it doesn't look as if you vote very differently from people who have no financial ties. So the NS is sort of not statistically significant. And similarly, if you have a tie to both the sponsor and a competitor, you don't look statistically different from someone who does not have a tie. So, this is vaguely interesting, but there's sort of one wrinkle to this, and probably multiple wrinkles, but the big one is that it turns out many of these votes are unanimous. So, and the reason for this is, in a lot of cases, when the scientific evidence is really clear in terms of the benefits versus the risks, everyone votes the same way, regardless of the ties that they have. So, what you want to do is sort of look at the cases where you can clarify sort of the role of the relationship. So what we do is we look at cases where the evidence is less clear. So maybe there's some safety issues that came up in the trials. So we partition the sample into those where there are split votes. And so when we look at that, it turns out to be about 61% of the sample. When we look at that, it turns out there's still that sponsor effect going on. When someone has a relationship only to the competitor, it looks like, at least statistically, you don't look very different from someone who doesn't have a tie. But the point estimate suggests actually that you may be more likely to vote in favor of the sponsor. And I think what I find most interesting is that if you have a financial interest with both the sponsor and the competitor, you also, statistically speaking, don't look different from someone with no financial ties. But you're actually less likely to favor the sponsor relative to people who have no ties. So I guess the upshot here is, well, when the scientific evidence is less clear, there are more questions about safety or efficacy. There's that sponsor effect, but then there's also, looks like there's some suggestion that if you have an exclusive tie to a competitor, you're more likely to favor the sponsor. And so that one interpretation of that is that it reflects some kind of pro-industry bias among people who have ties exclusively to competitors. And also there's some suggestion that if you have ties to both, that you're less favorable to the sponsor and you're more skeptical in judging the data. Okay. And finally, another thing you can do is sort of look at, well, maybe the types of financial ties matter. So you can run a big model and you can have, well, what if somebody's a consultant to a sponsor only, consultant to a competitor only, consultant to both, and throw the whole thing in, which doesn't fit on one slide, so I'll give you the highlights. But the big takeaway from this is that if you're a member of an advisory board or steering committee for the sponsor only, you really like the sponsor. So you're definitely much more likely to vote in favor of the sponsor. If you're a paid speaker for the sponsor only, you actually also vote in favor of the sponsor. But if you're a paid speaker for both the sponsor and the competitor, you're actually less likely to vote in favor of the sponsor. So what's the big takeaway from all this? If you have a tie solely to the sponsor, so an exclusive tie, you're more likely to favor the sponsor. Seems to be a big effect if you're on a member of an advisory board for the sponsor only. And the people with ties to both sponsor and competitors are actually, they look like they're pretty similar to people with no financial ties to either, and arguably maybe even more skeptical. And the big takeaway is it's complicated. So I think this means that just policymakers need to be a little bit more careful and more nuanced in how they manage conflicts of interest of FDA advisory committee members.
Thank you.